Vodka takes its name from the Slavic term Voda, meaning water, which may have come from a water of life reference, but ironically could be because vodka is usually about half water by volume. In this lecture, we will discuss the production methods of one of the world's most popular spirits. Popular less for its character than for its neutrality and flexibility, or maybe just as an effective ethanol delivery device. Let's go look at one of the world's most popular spirit categories. In this lecture, we'll discuss how vodka is made with its own challenges and how our flavored spirits like gins, liqueurs, spiced rums, through to bitters are created from a similar base spirit. We discuss these together at this level due to the similarity of neutral spirits and so many of our vodkas. So while vodka seems to be a separate category, it's really a name for diluted neutral spirits, or very nearly neutral spirits. Any spirit we've discussed so far, if we move that fermented liquid into a column still and go to a very high rectification, we can make vodka. In practice, we have most vodka being made from grains like barley, wheat, and rye, especially in Eastern Europe. Traditions and export level production are well established in Russia, Poland, Finland, and Sweden. Grains grow in these more inhospitable climates. They grow more than fruits, so our more northerly neighbors and those out on the prairie didn't have too many other options. We've also got our potatoes, especially in Poland, being used there as a base. While we could, and some do, use malted barley for conversion in the case of grains or potatoes, usually enzymes are just brought in to get those starches converted to sugars. Now, with the ease of fermenting grapes, we have seen vodkas from grapes. Whatever is around and plentiful is often used. So, for the rectification of these high-strength spirits, we are talking about column stills. And then even after that point, additional distillation techniques can be deployed to further refine and smoothen out the spirit. Now, some popular brands out there will say they are handmade in pot stills, but by now, you should be pretty doubtful of such a claim. However, what is popular is to purchase a neutral spirit, dilute it with water, and run that through a pot still. There is some smoothing out and some silkier texture that can be created in this process. But whether that counts as handmade pot still vodka, I'll leave that up to you. So with the nature of our spirit, dilution is clearly very important. And the texture of the water, its pH, can be very influential in how the finished vodka tastes, or as important as how it feels on the palate. Most producers nowadays will use pure denatured water and adjust mouthfeel and purity with filtration through activated charcoal, which we've seen is very common in spirit production. This is good for removing any harsh edges the vodka might have from aggressive or sloppy cuts. By removing some harsh character, sometimes there is an aromatic enhancement as more positive congeners, however faint, may now be able to show themselves. What finishing usually involves is the addition of character using additives. Almost all countries allow some additive in vodka finishing, and a bit of honey in Russia or citric acid in the US or glycerol somewhere else is often added to give the vodka some lift or additional smoothness and mouthfeel. So while we don't have very pronounced character here, unless it's a fault, we do have vodkas we call neutral that are smooth, light, and dry on the palate. And then we also have some that are more characterful, that have more flavor and more texture than those neutral ones. Now, while we have discussed our post-distillation flavors through maturation and finishing, what we're talking about here is having flavorings be introduced during distillation or afterwards to a degree where the flavorings do not augment our spirit so much as become a dominant characteristic of the spirit. Before we jump into the specific categories, let's just discuss what types of flavors and coloring components are used and how these are added to our spirit. We have natural flavors from fruit, herbs, spices that can be extracted from their base materials. These are often referred to as botanicals, especially in gin production. Botanicals doesn't have a global definition, but it's a sexier word than flavorings. Now, we can get flavor from these components by maceration, which is similar to the way making tea works. You place the materials in a porous bag or mesh filter and immerse them into a spirit. You don't have to do all your flavorings at once. You can do them separately, and given the solubility of compounds, this often will relate to the strength or ABV of the spirit. With greater and often harsher components, they can be released at higher ABVs. Now, if you remember our distillation lecture, color and bitterness don't make it through distillation. So if you are wanting those, especially, you'll be looking at maceration to accomplish this. Not only ABV, but time and temperature are also factors that affect the extraction here. A spirit flavored in this way is commonly called a tincture. Now, another way to accomplish the flavoring is through redistillation. At its most basic, we dump the flavorings into the pot and they macerate like before. Then we run a distillation, and some congeners will make it through the distillation. If we are using a delicately flavored botanical, like say cucumber, that might be changed by high heat, we can use a vacuum still to do this distillation. Just like water boils at a lower temperature at high elevations, doing the distillation at a low pressure can drop the temperature at which our vapors form before being collected. The other way to deal with our more delicate flavors is not to put them in the liquid, but put them higher up in the still or even in the line arm in a basket, a botanical basket, and run the vapors through the basket to extract the flavors. Then, as you might imagine, you could also just buy any pre-created flavorings that are safe for consumption or artificial flavorings and just add those to the spirit before blending or bottling. That is called cold compounding. Now, colors are handled similarly. We can do coloring with natural ingredients back at the maceration stage or use natural or artificial colors at the end. Artificial colors are pretty much required for our vivid colored liqueurs and may be used to ensure consistency even when some natural colors have been used as well. So our traditional flavored spirit would be gin, and due to its history, it's one of the few categories that comes with some legal classifications depending on how the flavoring was done and with regard to the base material. In the EU, gin is required to be made with a neutral spirit, which in the EU means distilled to 96% ABV. The US does not have this requirement, and labeling in the US versus EU does have some differences that you need to be aware of. Gin tends to come in two stylistic categories that are not really precisely defined. The more traditional juniper forward, where that pine sap resin character is front and center, and then our contemporary, which means maybe not. The only thing here is the juniper is certainly less dominant. Now, while the flavorings can be added through maceration, redistillation, or just added before bottling, our redistilled versions can pretty safely be deemed of higher quality, at least with regard to bottle price. Our Fleischmann's here is just gin from the US, so what the base is, we don't know. It doesn't have our other classifications that we'll show in a minute, so we can maybe expect juniper flavor number 5 was added just before bottling. If our American gin says distilled on the label, that means the flavorings were added through redistillation. In the EU, it doesn't mean that. Flavors can still be added in a distilled gin. The legally defined category in the EU is London dry gin. This label means all the botanical flavorings were done through redistillation. And you also see the vapor infused here. Bombay uses those vapor baskets for the infusion of not only classic juniper, but traditional orris root, citrus peel, angelica root, coriander seeds, and more. Stills fitted with these vapor baskets were often called Carter head stills, but now it's common to just have a little chamber up at the neck of the pot or on the line arm that can be activated with a bypass valve to use when it's needed. We also see Old Tom on labels, which is a term for sweetened gins, but it's not legally defined as to what sweetness level we're going to have. Sometimes these were not so much sweetened as having a lot of licorice added to them, which can make them seem sweet. These are pretty hard to find these days. So you might ask, what makes gin different than a flavored vodka? And that's a good question, which isn't easy to answer, except that presence of some juniper. Often the other difference, but not mandated, is that gins tend to have lots of botanicals and flavored vodkas tend to only have a couple at most. Our good old Fleischmann's could be labeled as juniper flavored vodka, I imagine. Now, flavored vodkas have exploded in popularity, and almost all brands have at least one flavored version. Here's a mango habanero flavored version. Now, there's no legal definition to denote redistilled processes were used for the flavoring, although some brands do take this seriously. Look at Belvedere's processes for an example. Now, there are some traditional flavored vodkas out there. Now, outside of the more English juniper gin arena, and we have spirits throughout Eastern Europe being flavored with fruits, spices, honey, and one traditional example is vodka flavored with bison grass. And often you'll see a little piece of grass in the bottle. It does look cool, but obviously that piece didn't come from redistillation. Now, also sometimes loosely fitting in this category are a few more categories. Our spiced rums, which are rums that are then flavored and usually heavily sweetened before bottling. If you watched our rum lecture, you'll remember that some rums can't be sweetened, and most rums don't see a lot of sweetening compared to what we're talking about here with something like Captain Morgan at 15-ish grams per liter, and then with some upwards of 50 grams per liter of sugar. Now, there's no obligation to say what is actually in these. And while they almost always have a dark color implying oak aging and natural processes, any redistillation of an oak aged spirit would be a waste of time and money, as the distillation process would not only strip the color, but would also remove a lot of the oak imparted flavors. So, coloring and sweetening before bottling is the norm. Now, those with the chemical anethol present, anethol has a very powerful flavor and is extracted from aniseed, fennel, and star anise. This chemical turns cloudy when mixed with water, especially cold water. This is called lushing and is generally expected when consuming, so dilution with water is common. Most often, quality producers are using maceration and also redistilling with the color coming from maceration, although very often our absinthe is colored to be the expected green hue. Pastis is very popular in the Mediterranean and must also have licorice as an ingredient. Pastis are also sweetened. Pastis really came about when absinthe was banned. It's an interesting story, but beyond the scope of this lecture. And its resurgence has also come with a lack of definition as to what absinthe is today. Now, it should be made with bitter flavored wormwood, which is an ancient medicinal ingredient. Traditionally, and different than pastis, it was not sweetened before bottling and was bottled at a very high ABV. The traditional method of presenting this included plenty of water for dilution, as well as the use of sugar for sweetening right at the time of consumption. So, speaking of bitter, we have classification of bitter tasting spirits led by the Italian version Amaro. Amaro is so dominant in the category that Amaro is often used to describe all spirits in this category. These are different than the plural bitters. These were often drunk as digestifs or aperitifs and are made from neutral spirits macerated with bitter botanicals. Now remember, we can't get bitter from redistillation, and though some flavor and aromatic compounds may be from redistillation, the telltale bitterness and balancing sweetness have to come from maceration or added in during blending before bottling. These consumption traditions have really only survived in their historic regions, and we see bitter spirits instead used mostly as ingredients in cocktails. The bitters are also used behind the bar, and bitters are high-strength, concentrated bitter tinctures used sparingly to give some character to cocktails. They are not drunk on their own like bitter spirits are. Now, liqueurs is a pretty loosely described category, with the only rule being that we are talking a flavored spirit that has been sweetened. Now, there are some legal minimum sugar contents in certain countries, but often there is not even a minimum ABV like in other categories. We see so much diversity in this category, from cotton candy liqueurs to 150-year-old Grand Marnier with a base spirit of cognac. We even see dairy products used in liqueurs. Now, we can have at least some delineation here with the flavoring ingredient, be it fruits like in Grand Marnier, or if it comes from nuts and seeds, herbs, or cream. Now, our final category is here because we really don't know where else to put it. These creatures do end up being behind the bar with the rest of our spirits, even though they are more of a wine with spirits and flavorings added. So, due to the company they keep, we're going to discuss them here. We start with a grape-based wine of any kind, white, red, or rosé, aromatic or neutral. Although our neutral high-acid whites, like those used in cognac, are probably the most used, allowing the botanicals a more blank canvas to play against. The spirits, usually somewhat neutral for the same reasons, and botanicals are put together in a range of ways, as in the gins and flavored vodkas we've discussed already. But not only are botanicals macerated and redistilled in the spirit, but sometimes the botanicals are macerated in the base wine. One of the only common threads here is a bitterness throughout. Our wormwoods, gentian, quinine, and other bitter ingredients often appear and are sometimes mandated in specific examples. To balance that bitterness, we often see sweetness being added, or in the case of Mistel and in the fashion of port, we stop the fermentation before all the sugars are consumed by adding in the spirits to kill the yeast during the fermentation process. This addition of spirits to wine is called fortification and is what makes a fortified wine fortified. Traditionally, this would act as a preservation mechanism as well. Sherries start as fully fermented wines that are fortified and are thus dry. Our ports are partially fermented before fortification and end up sweet. Now, I'd love to tell you that all aromatized wines use neutral alcohol, but that would be too easy. We do see distillates with a lot of character deployed here occasionally as well. I'd also love to say that all that's going on, there's no reason for added oak maturation and the related flavor development, but that sometimes happens too. So the only real rule is that we have a wine, we add flavorings somehow, we also have spirits involved, and we usually see sweeteners and colors added, but not always. Now, the most well-known example of aromatized wines are vermouths. They're now seeing a resurgence from previously being just a drop in a martini or Manhattan. Vermouths do require a wormwood ingredient for the bitterness. We have a rule. And the red versions are similar to the whites, but with coloring and usually more sweetness added. They are not made with red wines as you might have expected. Then we have our French canquina or Italian chinato, the same product, but different countries. These tend to use better quality, intensely flavored wines, especially the chinato. They often have gentian as well, but it's not required, as in the last version we'll mention, which is Americano, which you'll see as a cocktail with attempted similar flavors, but it is its own legal aromatized wine and must be made with gentian and wormwood. Now, the red may have come from a red wine, but it doesn't have to. So, our takeaways here are understanding what is involved in quality vodka, especially water and potential additives, as well as what happens in the distillery. Now, also how gin is made and the relation to potential quality, and then what the labels mean. Also, how flavored vodkas are similar and different than our gins, as well as the different techniques to create them. We also have our range of flavored spirits, including spiced rum, through the bitter spirits, what makes a liqueur, and then the leading examples of aromatized wines and their mandated ingredients. Whew. See you next time. Cheers.